Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you all today. I think it's probably an advantage coming towards the end of the day because I can build on some of the really excellent talks that we've had already, which have brought in so many different perspectives, I think, and I'm just going to complicate things by throwing in a slightly different idea and perspective, which is I'm going to focus mainly on my talk about making decisions for using experimental treatments in children. So, firstly, just a little bit about the Nuffield Council. So we are a bit like a national ethics council that exists in many other countries, but we are independent. We are not government appointed or government funded. We were set up around 30 years ago by the Nuffield Foundation, which is a charitable foundation in the UK. Because there was thought to be a lack of ethics advice in light of developments, particularly around embryo research. So our main activity over the last 30 years has been carrying out fairly in-depth inquiries that last around 18 months to 2 years, at the end of which we produce quite weighty reports, which normally include ethical frameworks, which are a way of thinking about the ethical questions raised by developments in biology and medicine, and then some recommendations for policy and practice. More recently, we've been trying to be a little bit more agile and a bit quicker in the way that we respond to debates that are happening in the world. So we have started a new series of outputs and documents, which are these bioethics briefing notes, and we've done 5 now. And these are the 2 most recent ones, both of which are relevant to the discussion today. So I've got some copies of the one on the right on patient access to experimental treatments. The one on the left, disagreements in the care of critically ill children, was only published on Thursday last week, so I'm afraid I haven't got any spare copies of that one yet, but they're both available on the website to download if you want to look at them afterwards. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we did on these 2 documents. Although they are short, they still aim to be high quality. They're peer-reviewed. In the development of each, we did quite extensive consultation and talking to people who've been affected by these developments. So I don't come to you with the sort of normal Nuffield, fully formed policy recommendations, but I hope still a useful contribution to the debate today. So first of all, just a little bit of background, which I won't go into any detail because this has been covered earlier in the day, but there are several ways in which patients and doctors can legally access experimental treatments in the UK. Most of these are access outside of research, and as you can see, medicines, medical devices, advanced therapies, all have different ways in which there are provisions for accessing them. But of course, acting legally is not the same thing as acting ethically. And often this comes down to the decision of the healthcare professional involved. The General Medical Council in the UK, which is the regulator of doctors and healthcare practitioners, states that doctors must provide treatments based on the best available evidence and that patients must be told whether proposed treatment is experimental and about any additional risks or uncertainties. But beyond this, and within the constraints of available funding, it's up to doctors to judge what treatment to offer based on their knowledge of the patient. So I'm going to cover just 2 main themes in terms of the ethical issues raised by access to experimental treatments. The first one on equity of access, which we've heard a little bit about already today. And the second one, which I'll be mainly covering, is around challenges to do with decision-making. But equity of access is, of course, important because patients don't always have the same kind of access to experimental treatments. And in the UK, it is not standard practice for the NHS to fund experimental treatments, although doctors can prescribe them if they can persuade their NHS trust or commissioning body to fund them. But this leads to variations between regions and between countries in what patients get what. So, for example, the drug Orkambi, which is for cystic fibrosis, has been available through a compassionate use scheme in England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, but it's not available in Wales, which doesn't seem very fair. We do have some schemes which have tried to increase access to promising drugs, and the Cancer Drugs Fund was something set up in 2011. It was over £1 billion. It was announced by our then Prime Minister, David Cameron, and widely thought to be a political move rather than something that was thought to be benefiting patients. The main criticism was about the lack of monitoring of patients who were accessing drugs through that scheme. So it was revised in 2016, and monitoring was introduced, and things got much better, and I believe now 30 drugs have been funded through that scheme, and I think all but 2 of them now have been approved by NICE, which is the National Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence, which decides what drugs is available to people on the NHS. So all but 2 of those drugs have now been approved for use on the NHS. But many feel that's still unfair, because what about patients with other conditions who are not being allowed to access very expensive drugs? So sometimes manufacturers might be allowed to offer experimental treatments, but there's no guarantee that they can or will offer them to all the patients that might benefit. There's always crowdfunding, and this is being used increasingly as a way for patients to raise their own funds to pay for treatments. It was a study that showed, I think, about 550 crowdfunding appeals have been set up to raise funds for UK patients to have experimental cancer treatments since 2012, most of which were offered abroad. But even that sometimes is not enough. Some of these drugs are unbelievably expensive. Speranza, for example, which I don't think would be classed as an experimental drug now, actually. It's a drug for spinal muscular atrophy, and it costs £750,000 for the first year of treatment. A very promising treatment which many parents are desperate to have access to in the UK. So, moving on to my next kind of area, ethical challenges, is, I think, for me, the most important one, which is around decision making. How does decisions get made by patients and doctors about when to access experimental treatments and which ones? So, of course, there's a number of features of experimental treatments which make those decisions extremely difficult. One we've heard about a lot today is around uncertainty about safety and efficacy. But often those those decisions can be made in extremely stressful situations where patients can be in life-threatening conditions, in a lot of pain. Patient-doctor dynamics can be significant. Patients might be strongly persuaded by the opinion of their doctor, or feel unable to question their judgment. And also, we're in a context of online information, from peer-reviewed journals, patient forums, which can be very useful, through to downright rubbish. And I've seen with my own eyes how difficult it can be for people to sift through what's reliable and what's not reliable. And of course, language is important as well. As Jonathan pointed out just before, the word innovative, novel, those kind of words can be value-laden and suggest something about a treatment that might be misleading. When it comes to clinics or companies that are trying to sell treatments, of course they will be marketing their treatments in a way that means they want to sell them, which can, again, raise challenges for people to sift out what's important and what's not. And within all that as well, there is the challenge of conflicts of interest. and with healthcare professionals. So, of course, the primary duty of a healthcare professional is to offer the best possible treatments for their patients, but they might also be driven by other incentives. So, for example, the desire to advance medical knowledge, the desire to enhance their own reputation or that of their institution, and possibly financial incentives as well. And there have been some cases have come to light about, for example, medical device manufacturers incentivizing doctors to use their devices. Oh yeah, I just put that on the slide. The FDA has started to clamp down on, for example, stem cell clinics offering very dubious treatments for aging and sort of regeneration of, yeah. So these are all classed as experimental on the one hand, but might be thought of as just slightly bonkers on the other. Okay, so these challenges are strong enough, but I'd like to suggest when you put children into the mix, all those challenges become heightened. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of cases that have reached the courts in the UK in recent years. On the right-hand side is a boy called Ashia King, who's a boy with brain cancer with his parents. And on the left, this is the baby Charlie Gard with his parents, which was a case that came to the courts in 2017. But first of all, just to quickly run over what the law and guidance says about how to make treatment and care decisions about children. So professional guidance across the board says that treatment and care decisions should be made in the best interests of the child. The parents must consent to any intervention made to their child. There's no obligation on doctors to provide treatment that they do not believe to be in the child's best interest. So taken all together, okay, so the upshot is that parents and doctors should ideally agree on the care and treatment through a process of shared decision making. If they disagree, there's a number of interventions that can be taken. In most cases, it seems that discussion between the family and the doctors leads to a resolution. Both parties can seek a second expert opinion. Some hospitals have clinical ethics committees that can be called upon, but they vary quite widely in their makeup and the processes that they use. Some hospitals have access to mediation, and then there's also the courts that can be called upon as well. And I don't have exact figures. Those figures don't exist at the moment, but it's thought that around 10 cases a year go to the courts in the UK regarding the medical treatment, a disagreement about the medical treatment of a child. A problem with these interventions, these resolution interventions, we don't really know what works. There is very little evidence, and there's been very little research done on how conflicts or disagreements are resolved between parents and doctors. So, for example, second opinions are available, but of course, you have to be very careful that both parties view that opinion to be independent. Otherwise, it's not really probably going to help much with the dispute. I'll move on to that in a moment. Okay, so just to run through a little bit about what happened in these cases. So Ashia King was a boy with brain cancer. He was put forward for a new kind of radiotherapy called Proton beam therapy, which the NHS was funding some patients to go abroad to have this treatment because it was looking so promising. And there was a review board set up to look at requests for the treatment. But it was decided that Ashia was not suitable for the new treatment, and it was recommended that he have traditional radiotherapy, the traditional treatment. His parents were unhappy with that treatment plan, so they took him abroad to Spain, and for reasons that are not totally clear, an international arrest warrant was issued for his parents because, well, it's suggested because they thought that Ashia was at risk of coming to significant harm. His parents were arrested and detained in Spain, and Ashia was taken to the nearest hospital for urgent medical treatment. At this point, the case went to the courts in the UK, and the judge decided that his parents' request for the experimental therapy was reasonable, and Ashia had the treatment in Prague, and the latest that we've heard was last year when Ashia, who's now 8, was reported to have been cleared of cancer. Charlie Gard was a baby born in 2016 with a very rare kind of mitochondrial disease. He was very seriously ill. His parents did some Googling and found out about a new kind of treatment that was being tested out in the US, nucleoside therapy. It was being tested on patients with not exactly Charlie's condition, but with other kinds of mitochondrial disease. And the parents asked, would Charlie be suitable for this kind of treatment? The hospital, which is Great Ormond Street Hospital, explored whether Charlie could have the treatment. And again, for reasons which are not entirely clear to us, it was decided that the hospital would not support the trial of Charlie to have a trial of this treatment, even though the parents had raised 1.2 million through crowdfunding, so they did not have to rely on NHS funds to have the treatment. So at this point we had a disagreement, severe disagreement about what to do, and the question about what should happen to Charlie went through a series of court cases after several appeals, and it eventually went to the Supreme Court as well. And in every one of those cases, the judge decided in favour of the hospital, and eventually Charlie's life support was withdrawn, and he died in July 2017. So we've recently done a little bit of work looking at these cases. So very big news in the UK. And clearly, they had really significant adverse effects on everyone involved. So for the baby, the children involved, it could lead to a delay in a decision about their treatment. So for example, for Charlie, those court cases took around 6 months. So during which time he may have been subjected to painful procedures in the intensive care unit. Talking more generally, of course, it's not just about those two cases, but for parents, it can mean intense distress and anxiety. If their case is public, it can mean commentary and abuse from third parties, and it can mean financial strain for them as well. For the healthcare professionals involved, it can also be extremely distressing, particularly if the case was public. It can again lead to them being subjected to intimidation and abuse. For other parents of critically ill children, it can lead to a loss of trust in or feelings of guilt about decisions made about their own children. And for the healthcare systems more generally, it goes against their general aim to maintain good relationships between patients and doctors, but also significant time resources, significant financial resources, loss of staff morale, and reputational effects as well, both in the UK and abroad, because it was an international news story. So we wanted to look at what was at the root of some of these disagreements happening between parents and healthcare staff, and could there be ways in which they could be prevented or at least resolved more quickly. So we did a number of activities to consult with stakeholders and people involved, including parents who've been involved in some of these disagreements. And although, of course, every single situation is different, we identified some common themes that seem to be triggers or causes of disagreements becoming protracted and entrenched. So number one was communication issues. And for me, this is really sort of at the root of it. It came up time and time again. And it seems simple, but receiving conflicting messages from different members of staff, someone using insensitive language to talk about your child, can be that moment when the trust breaks down and things go in different directions and you stop being a collaborative team and become two parties on different sides. The second one was around differing perspectives, and I think we've heard this in evidence today as well, that healthcare teams and patients can come at these questions about what to do, what risks should we take from completely different perspectives. And for a doctor, maybe what might be viewed as a very small chance of anything having a benefit, and they might use terms like futile, for example. For a family member, for a parent, even the smallest chance that something might help is worth clinging on to and worth giving a go before you feel like you can consent to life support being withdrawn. So it's an understanding of those completely different perspectives that the two teams might take. They also may disagree on who should make the decision. So I set out earlier that it should be a shared process, but I saw in evidence the different ways that people can interpret shared decision making. So it could mean for a healthcare team, them coming to agreement amongst themselves and then asking the parents to consent or sign up to their view. And we found sometimes that the root cause of that was around people feeling like asking parents to, for example, consent to withdrawal of life support if their child was too great a burden for them to bear. But research has shown that often parents see that as part of their responsibility and something they want to be an active part of. 3 was feelings of powerlessness. So on both sides, parents told us they often felt excluded from conversations about their child, did not have access to the full set of medical notes. And also, if a case came to court, their child would be represented separately by an appointed guardian. And also in the UK, surprisingly, parents in these situations are not entitled to legal aid either. Staff also reported feelings of powerlessness, so they felt unsupported by their employer to cope with these very difficult conversations and distressing situations, and also felt like their views were not being aired in public debates about some of these cases as well. Even if it was not a child in their care, many healthcare professionals are not allowed to speak to journalists about their views on things. So again, they felt like they were lacking control and power in the situation. And the fourth theme was around delays in seeking help. So some of those resolution interventions that I mentioned earlier, sometimes, or often, it seems that healthcare teams wait too late to call in third-party help, like mediation or clinical ethics committees, for a whole host of reasons, but might include a feeling that constituted a failure on their part for not being able to resolve the disagreement themselves, but also a lack of awareness that those interventions are available to them, but also there might be patchy access to those interventions across the UK. So, these decisions are not made in a vacuum. So we also felt that what's going on in the world around us could be having an influence on the kind of discussions that were happening about whether children should have experimental treatments, what should happen to them, what was in their best interests. And we identified a number of different aspects, which are, will be no surprise to you, some of which we've heard about already. I mean, the top one is advances in medicine. I mean, this is, in essence, why some of these conversations are happening at all. Children are now being kept alive who would have previously died shortly after birth. So creating new ethical dilemmas for parents and doctors to deal with. We're also in the UK. I mean, not everyone, this is a sweeping generalisation, but we tend to be quite bad at talking about death and dying, including doctors. Although there's some really excellent initiatives to try and get us better at talking about those things. On the slide, there's just 2 really excellent books that I've read recently I would highly recommend. With the End in Mind is a book by Catherine Mannix, who is a palliative care consultant. And it's about 30 stories of patients that she has cared for at the end of their lives. So it's sort of about debunking myths about the dying process. And I was thinking maybe there should be one for children as well, but I'm not sure. It would be very difficult reading, I'm sure. Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal, it's a few years old now, so maybe some of you have come across it. I think his main message, he's a doctor as well, I think his main message was more for healthcare professionals, and it was about knowing when to stop trying to treat, and when to think about managing symptoms and making every day the best it could be. We're also, of course, living in a world where we can find stuff online. We're empowered as patients or as parents. We're living in very multicultural societies who have often different views about end of life and interventions and withdrawing care as well. In the UK, our NHS is under probably the most financial pressure that it ever has been, creating huge challenges for those that are allocating funding. And we're also living in a world where, of course, we've always had the media, but social media, which is a fairly recent addition to our society, it's a way for everyone and parents to express their views, to garner support, to crowdfund, and it's also a way for people all around the world to promote their own agendas and their own views. And we saw that very much in some of the cases that I talked about, because they were absolutely huge stories. This is just a selection of the headlines around the case of Charlie Gard and his parents there. Every step of the way it was reported, and I think there was an element of sensationalism in there, and also some reporting that I find it hard to really get to the bottom of and sort of know why the media went the way it did. So just for an example, the doctor in America who was testing out this nucleoside therapy that Charlie's parents wanted him to have, was very much made out in the press to be like some kind of quack. And actually he's a professor of neurology at Columbia University who's, there's nothing to suggest that he's in any way an unreliable doctor or someone who's that they shouldn't trust. So I found that odd. But certainly, I mean, this must have created such intense pressure on everyone involved in that case. So, move on a bit. I said we didn't come out with any strong recommendations in our briefing note, but we did make some suggestions for what we should be striving for in healthcare environments to help disagreements be resolved more quickly, or perhaps to avoid them altogether. So number one, good communication between families and staff, and an understanding of differing perspectives. And there's been some really positive initiatives around training, conflict management training in hospitals. This woman on the left here, Sarah Barkley, she's run something called the Medical Mediation Foundation in the UK, and she's been working with the Evelina Children's Hospital in London on what they've called the Resolution Project, and it's a package of training and mediation and sort of conflict management framework for staff in the hospital, and it's had some really excellent outcomes. I think of the staff that's taken part in the training, which I had the good fortune to attend myself actually, and gain some very excellent, some very useful life skills at the training. I think something like of the staff who took part in the training, who experienced conflict in the 6 months afterwards, I think something like 91% said that it helped them recognise disagreement early and help them de-escalate the conflict. So more of that, we think, would be great. Involvement of parents in discussions and decisions. So we're recommending that NHS hospitals should think of ways in which parents can become more of an active part of the decision-making process. And perhaps as well that healthcare staff could understand a little bit more about the motivations of parents to seek experimental treatments. So there's been some really interesting research done by David Wendler in the US, and he was looking at the motivations of parents. He found that as well as hoping for clinical improvements, parents want to try such treatments as a way of expressing their love for their child and ensuring that they did everything they could. And perhaps understanding that a little bit better might help healthcare staff to think about whether a limited trial of a treatment could be possible and help reduce conflicts with family. So I realise I'm slightly conflating, the kind of medical view of, or is it worth, let's weigh up the risks and benefits. Is it worth trying this treatment or not? But there's this disagreement element as well, which I think is a thing that we need to be attuned to, because when things go wrong, as we saw in a couple of UK cases, it can lead to real damage for everyone involved. So perhaps it's weighing up not just the medical facts and evidence, but thinking about maintaining relationships as well and the importance of that. So number 3, timely use of effective resolution interventions. I mentioned earlier that we don't really know what is effective yet, but then again, if we don't use them more and gather evidence on that, then we'll never know. So perhaps hand in hand with having more clinical ethics committees and mediation and expert opinions available, we can start to think about what works in those situations. And finally, attention to the profound psychological effects on families and staff of having to make these decisions and about the disagreements that can occur. There's certainly a lack of psychological support for both families and staff in hospitals in the UK. So I'm just going to finish to tell you a little bit about what's happened since those court cases that I mentioned. So the parents of Charlie Gard and a group of parliamentarians and some doctors and some other experts as well are putting together proposals for something for what they're calling Charlie's Law. So their objectives very much align with ours, which is to try and prevent parents and doctors having to go through these horrendous court cases. They don't want people to have to go through the same thing that they did. So what Charlie's Law proposes is to allow parents the freedom to seek disease-modifying treatment if there is a reputable institution willing to provide it and it does not cause the child significant harm. If there is thought to be a risk of significant harm, they suggest then a court could be asked to decide what's in the child's best interests. So they suggest this is analogous with care proceedings in the UK. So basically we're allowed to bring up our children as we like. The state doesn't generally like to interfere with family life until there is thought to be a risk of serious harm, or the child is suffering serious harm, and then local authorities can get involved and children can be taken away from their parents. They say this is analogous with that, allows parents the freedom to seek experimental treatments if they wish to. So this threshold of significant harm was considered in another case, and they don't really like me using this comparison because it's a little bit different. So just to emphasise the differences, the case of Alfie Evans was another child whose case was brought to the High Court in 2018. The question was whether Alfie's life support should be withdrawn. There wasn't any experimental treatment in the picture, but still his parents asked the Supreme Court to consider their proposal that the first question should be whether what they wanted would cause the child significant harm, And in that case, the judge rejected that proposal, saying it was not consistent with the founding rule of best interest. So this is to come. We shall see how this pans out. I think it's going to be controversial, but yeah, we shall be there to hopefully contribute and inform debate around any possible changes in the law. Leave it there.
Thank you for a very good presentation, which added value to this afternoon very much. I would like to ask you about the reasons for disagreement that you proposed, the 4 points. To me, they sound mostly of a psychological kind, but couldn't there be also more genuine ethical value differences between parents and the health team, and also within the health team? What is the right thing to do in this case? Genuine ethical dilemmas.
Yeah, I'm sorry if that didn't come across. I think I meant to capture that in the second point on the sort of differing perspectives. Because I would... Do you think there is an actual right or wrong thing to do in certain situations then? Or is it about... Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that's in combination with medical facts, with professional guidance about how you weigh up best interest, because that is set out quite significantly. But I think it all comes down to a judgment in the end.